Hi everyone, Fran here at New Testament Explained. Welcome back to the channel. If you're not already subscribed to the channel and the notification bell, make sure you do that. Today's video is looking at religious groups in 1st century Palestine. As always, this aligns with Edexcel's A Level Religious Studies specification, but if you're more interested in this area, you will be more than fine watching the rest of this video. So the first group that we're going to look at are the Sadducees. And we're going to look firstly at their role and impact on life in 1st century Palestine. Now, the Sadducees were Jewish priests who worked at the temple in Jerusalem, but they also dominated the Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish council. They are very strict about following Jewish laws, and they favoured a literal reading of the Pentateuch, which was the first 5 books of the Torah, and these 5 books contained all the laws. As a consequence of that, they rejected oral law, which were post-biblical Jewish legal traditions, so they rejected those, and they also rejected post-Pentateuch beliefs, and those included angels, demons, and the afterlife. Beyond that, they believed that in order to maintain the temple, they had to seek protection from whoever was in power at the time, and therefore the Sadducees were willing to accept Roman leadership. Romans allowed the Sadducees to appoint chief priests as well, so they had a deal going on whereby the temple was protected by the Romans and the Sadducees were allowed to appoint the chief priest. Most Jews supported the temple and the work of the priests inside the temple, but they didn't like the Sadducees themselves because they were associated with wealth and with collaborating with the Romans. So this group are not entirely popular for that reason. The area we need to look at for the specification is the influence of the Sadducees on the life and work of Jesus. And the way this is set up on this video is a two-sided argument where the left and right hand side are linked together. So one way in which the Sadducees can be seen to have had an impact on the life and work of Jesus is that Jesus' works bring him into conflict with the Sadducees, who ask him awkward questions about the afterlife. Now, a counter-argument that would say maybe the Sadducees didn't have as much of an impact as one might first assume is the fact that Jesus in those situations could respond by referring to Moses and the story of the burning bush, which is in the Torah and therefore respected by the Sadducees, the first 5 books. A second argument you could look at is that the raising of Lazarus led to an emergency meeting with the Sanhedrin. Remember, the Sadducees are in the Sanhedrin, and they are worried that the Romans would close the temple. Now, the counter-argument here is that the Sadducees' concern with regards to the raising of Lazarus seems to be far-fetched. And again, if you read the extracts in the Gospels, you can look in more detail as to why that's the case. And finally, there are philosophical debates with the Sadducees, and these escalate when Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the Passover, to the point where within a week he's on trial with the Sanhedrin, which seems to suggest that they have clashed and it has impacted on his life. And then the counter-argument there is that Jesus' main charge is that he offends the high priest because he was claiming to be the Messiah. So maybe these philosophical debates don't entirely explain why the narrative plays out the way that it does. Now, if you are studying Edexcel A Level Religious Studies, at this point I would recommend linking this topic to topic 5.2, which looks at why Jesus comes into conflict, and that will take some of these narratives into more detail. The second group we're going to look at then are the Pharisees. This group also worked in the Sanhedrin. They want people to follow laws, but they also want people to update and interpret them. And that is what makes this group different to the Sadducees. They are in favour of updates and interpretations, hence this symbol of at the top of the idea of changing over time, cycle. They favoured oral law, and what they thought is that cases and examples should be used to demonstrate how laws should be applied to people at the time. And it would give detailed extra regulations to people to stop them from accidentally breaking the law. Pharisees accepted post-Pentateuch teachings, And ultimately this group are quite popular and have a very strong influence in first century Palestine. So in terms of the Pharisees and their influence on the life and work of Jesus, again, arguments and counter-arguments here. Jesus clashes with the Pharisees on many occasions in the Gospels. This makes sense in that Jesus travelled around ordinary Jewish towns preaching his message. And the Pharisees were the main religious group away from Jerusalem and the temple. So you can understand why the Pharisees might feel threatened by Jesus as he comes around ordinary Jewish towns preaching his message. So that makes sense geographically. The counter-argument is that whilst Jesus did clash with Pharisees due to where he is and what he's saying, there are also Pharisees who seem to follow Jesus. The Gospel names some Pharisees, which suggests there must have been a degree of a relationship to know their names, but also there are some Pharisees present at the crucifixion of Jesus. So whilst there are clashes, evidently, there are some Pharisees who do seem to have followed Jesus in some capacity. Second argument is that Jesus condemns the Pharisees for being spiritually proud, and he accuses them of focusing too much on following the rules. He says that's not the right focus to have. The counter-argument is that whilst there are some differences, there are also similarities, and Jesus shared a lot in common with the Pharisees. For example, as an example to back yourself up here, he shared the belief that faith was more about sticking to the Torah than animal sacrifice in the temple. Thirdly, Matthew's Gospel has really heated attacks on the Pharisees. So Jesus attacks the Pharisees quite aggressively. He pronounces several words, which is curses, on the Pharisees, and he calls them snakes. The counter-argument to that is that some argue Jesus was a Pharisee, and the reason these arguments are so heated and exaggerated is that he was in the group, and the Jewish debate was quite heated and exaggerated, and therefore it's not that the clash is really heated, but it's just a debate that he's involved in, and part of that debate was getting heated. And the final argument that stands by itself is that Jesus criticised the Pharisees and their notion of being pure, because what it led to is the Pharisees avoiding the company of people like publicans and the sick, whereas Jesus was all-inclusive. As we do in the Kingdom of God unit in 5.1, the Kingdom of God is for all. So this doesn't fit this notion of Pharisees seeing themselves as pure and therefore avoiding certain people. The third group then are the scribes. They are a group of Jews in first century Palestine who made copies of the Torah, as indicated by their title, scribes, as well as writing legal documents. They therefore knew the words of the Torah better than other people because they are always engaging with the Torah when making copies. Sometimes they also teach people about the Torah as well. There's not too strong of a debate when it comes to the impact of the scribes on the life and work of Jesus. I'm going to move on to the Essenes at this point. So these were a separate community. They lived by the Dead Sea, hence the waves, and they refused to accept Roman rule. So Roman occupation, which we look at in topic 1.2, you can watch the video on that. They are just against it, and they don't like people who accept Roman rule either. Anyone who accepts Roman rule, they did not see as being properly Jewish. And so their reaction to Roman occupation, is to retreat to the desert and to live almost as a monastic community by themselves, isolated. The Essenes had a very narrow view of who was truly Jewish, which we kind of got an indication of above. Only accepting members of their small group were considered truly Jewish. They believed prophecies and expected God to arrive at any moment to fight against the Romans and the non-Jews. And during the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, the Essenes joined in this revolt and were destroyed. So they have quite specific views, not only about the Romans, but what is going to happen to them. Their influence, impact on the life and work of Jesus. So the Bible doesn't mention the Essenes, but it is believed that Jesus may have been an Essene himself. A scholar called Barbara Thiering argues that Jesus could have been the teacher of righteousness, who is a figure mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, written by the Essenes. The counter-argument is the fact the Bible doesn't mention this group explicitly. You perhaps would expect it to be mentioned if Jesus was an Essene. I imagine it would be quite a big point to mention, but the absence of this group being mentioned may undermine the notion that Jesus was an Essene. Secondly, Jesus began his ministry by being baptized by John the Baptist, who was an Essene, and as did his disciples. The baptism itself is an Essene ritual. The counter-argument just follows on from this idea that Jesus being an Essene doesn't really add up. So the teacher of righteousness would have lived 100 years before Jesus' time, so that doesn't add up. And also the Essenes cut themselves off from the sinful world, whereas Jesus went into the towns. You wouldn't expect Jesus to be as involved in the towns had he have been an Essene. Finally, Jesus went into the desert to pray and fast for 40 days, 40 nights, where he was tempted by the devil. Very famous Bible passage. This sort of religious retreat often took place at an Essene monastery in the desert. And the Bible doesn't say that he was alone, so he may well have gone and interacted with this group. Even if he wasn't an Essene himself, he may still have gone and interacted with them. Counter-argument is that it is assumed he was by himself. The Bible passage isn't clear as to whether he was alone, whether he wasn't alone, but the absence of an answer means that a lot of people do assume he was by himself. Next and finally are the Zealots. So they believed in prophecies of a great battle where God would come and fight against the Romans. They therefore expect a bloody war, and they would, in that war, be able to show and demonstrate their faith by being martyred. In terms of how kind of a modern audience consider this group, making comparisons, we would see them as a terrorist group who engaged in guerrilla warfare. They would attack people and rob people from the hills. So our comparison to try and understand what this group are like would be to think of a terrorist organisation. Zealots saw God as the only authority and didn't accept Roman rule. And for example, they wouldn't pay taxes, so they sort of refused to engage with this notion of Roman occupation. To them, the armed struggle was more important than obedience to law. And because they believed in the afterlife, they were almost eager to martyr themselves to demonstrate their faith. In some cases, there are accounts whereby Zealots would commit mass suicide as opposed to being caught by the Romans, kind of showing the extremity of where they would take this. Zealots assassinated many Jews who collaborated with the Romans, so again, not only did they disapprove of Roman occupation, but they also took issue with Jews who would collaborate with the Romans. And an example here is that Jonathan the high priest was assassinated by the Zealots. And in terms of their influence on the life and work of Jesus, a scholar called Brandon has a very interesting argument that Judas was a zealot and Jesus was a revolutionary political leader who everyone expected to raise an army against the Romans. And it's because Jesus doesn't do this that Judas betrayed him. So it's quite an interesting theory there, that Judas is a zealot and the reason he betrays Jesus is because he has not carried through on his expectations. The counter-argument is that Jesus completely opposes zealot violence. He teaches a philosophy of non-violence and urges his followers to put away any weapons. And you can use Matthew 5:39 to support that. So Jesus' non-violent philosophy doesn't seem to align with Brandon's theory. Another example you can use to show their influence, the Zealots' influence, is that one of the 12 disciples is a Zealot, Simon. And the question at this point would be, why would Jesus recruit a zealot? Now, a kind of answer to this, a counter-argument that could explain why this was the case, is that scholars think Jesus recruited Simon to balance Matthew, the tax collector. So there's two people within this group of disciples who should hate each other, but because they work together as disciples, they actually demonstrate the love and forgiveness of God, and they work together within this group to sort of prove a moral message about the kingdom of God. And the final argument is that Jesus was mistaken for a zealot. He was crucified between two prisoners described as thieves and rebels by Matthew and Mark, and the same word was used to describe Barabbas. So maybe the zealots did have an influence, not kind of on Jesus directly per se, but in terms of how the crucifixion comes about. So that marks the end of this video, where we've looked at the key religious groups in 1st century Palestine. We've looked at their role and influence in 1st century Palestine, quite broadly speaking, and then looked a little bit more specifically at their influence on the life and work of Jesus. Thank you for watching. As always, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and notification bell, make sure you do so. But apart from that, see you soon.